thousands of people set foot onto the stage at our conferences every year to give the talk of their lives. 18 minutes of succinct summary of a lifetime's worth of their work. The topics range from anything from robotics to exoplanetary explorations to archery. And when they go on stage, the idea gets amplified onto the TED online platforms and gets spread across the world. And TED is a nonprofit organization. That's a sort of a little known fact there. Unlike a lot of media companies who push out about 8 pieces of content, or New York Times push out like over 200 content a day, TED pushes out 1 talk per day. And so that makes it a bit of a challenge, a unique challenge in the media landscape these days in terms of how we think about growth. Today, as it pertains to the app ecosystem, I'm going to be talking a little bit about our plans for internationalization and use of that as our growth strategy, what we've done so far, what worked, what didn't work, and what we're thinking about in the near future. So back for a second. So the internationalization as a growth strategy isn't really, it'd be a little bit of a overshot to call it a strategy. We didn't actually come up with that strategy. It kind of came to us. We put our talks out, and then one day we get like an email that says, hey, can I translate your talk? Because I really like it and I want to be able to share it with my family. And so we said, sure, why not? So a couple of people sent us this email, and then basically, it became like really widespread and really popular. And so we formulate eventually what's called a TED translation team. Right now, today, a TED translation team has been ongoing for about 5 years. There's over 27,000 volunteer translators worldwide that produces over 110,000 translations for us in over 114 languages. And they do this all for free. So now we have this whole giant corpus of content. One of the big challenges to us is that how do we get it out, right? So for perspective, we are on planet Earth, and there's 7.2 billion people currently. 4.1 billion people speaks 23 languages. That's the market size. And English is right here. So the challenge that we run into when we have all the corpus of these translated talk is that there's a bit of a barrier. So if you're Japanese and you speak Japanese and your English is not great, going to TED.com and seeing English and using the apps all in English, you might have a hard time trying to find the content that you actually can consume because of the navigation and the wayfinding. So we decided to translate our apps. The very first time we translated our app was in 2015, and we didn't really quite do a good job at it. And one of the things that we found the hard way was that app translation is very, very hard. Namely, when you translate a talk, it's quite finite, right? So you have a piece of content, it's really interesting, the translators are engaged, they do it, they finish, they submit, that's fine. But in app translation, you have to pair up all of your translations with all of your app releases. It's quite tedious, and you have to send screenshots for every single translation because there's character count and context and all sorts of stuff. So what ends up happening is that we weren't able to pair up the translation workflow with our product development workflow, and the product kind of lagged behind. In 2016, we tried again. So now we got on the SmartLink translation platform, we improved our process, and now not only are we able to just translate the Android app, we can actually onboard all of our app ecosystem onto this platform, pair up development cycle with the translation cycle. We can also use the same platform to translate all of our marketing collaterals as well. Today, we have about 24 languages that we currently support across the mobile apps, and about 16 or so on Apple TV. So it's been about a year. Just sharing some basic stats here. We saw that 45% of our unique users are now on non-English version, a little bit better on the Android side than the iOS side, and that's to be expected. The subtitle usage have grown about 67% year over year, And we saw a general kind of viewership growth of 25% this past year in 2016. 79% of our traffic on the app comes from outside of the United States, with Asia Pacific leading the way. This is a quick view of, the penetration between iOS and Android. It is not all created equal. We say that Android, there's a lot more Android market share out there than the iOS. What we saw is that while that is true, and it is quite strong in Asia Pacific, our shares are counted as viewership, so engagement of our content. So our iOS users are actually consuming more content than our Android users, kind of person by person. So how did this happen? We did a really great job at growing using this strategy, but translating the UI alone didn't actually just, do the trick. We did a lot of work on App Store optimization and engagement in order to make this happen. Some of this will be pretty basic to some of you and perhaps not so much for others. So we did a lot of detailed work on the App Store display using single action verb leading the feature tour, being very, very succinct about our features, really relying on our graphics to tell the story at a glance. We're pretty keen on using one-liner at the very, very top to succinctly describe the product as a value proposition to the user, not what it is about, but why it's important to the user, and then sort of follow that with detailed paragraph describing the products later. We also translate everything, and we change our screenshots for every single language. On Android, you can do a lot of A/B testing with this stuff, so we matched UI screen of the leading talk with topics or speakers that resonate with that particular region. So, for example, in Japan, Japanese speakers do really well, so we kind of go out of our way to do that. This is Korea, they like technology, so that's kind of what we did. We also didn't just translate the app description. We actually did quite a bit of research in terms of what the TED brand means in each market, and write our App Store description to tailor to to that experience. Along with that research, one of the things that was pretty interesting is an insight around what does the brand mean to you. So when we conducted that research, one of the things we found was that, for example, in India, TED means self-improvement. So that means these are the talks to make me become a better person. Here, it's more about ideas and technology and science. In Europe, geopolitics is pretty big. And in China, TED is actually an English language learning tool. So knowing that is pretty important in order to craft out the right keywords for your App Store and discovery. So this is our conversion funnel. This is where we scratch our head the most. Data is really important, but when you compare data across multiple app stores, it can be pretty gnarly. So in this funnel, we all know that a page view is not the same thing as a visitor, right? And install versus active installs versus app unit, these metrics are pretty common for App Store people who look at App Store data all the time. But if you were to compare iOS and Android apps, it's actually not apples to apples, or it's not the same. It's not apples to Android. So the metric that we actually look at and care about the most in this particular funnel, given all of the sort of inconsistencies and chaos that precedes it, is the first-time users. How can we convert our engagement in terms of our acquisition activities and churning that into our first-time users, and how can we keep them and convert them into repeat users? So in order to do that, we also look at things like, rates of those people who never open and also dropouts. Another thing we did that was pretty interesting was that we did hero image testing. And what we found is that some countries gravitate towards translated image. So this is an example where Chinese, we got a 13.8% increase when we translate the word ideas worth spreading. It turns out this is not the case in Korea, or I believe the Philippines. So some market actually prefers the tagline in English, and some prefers in localized language. So you have to kind of test that case by case. Beyond acquisition on the App Store side, we also do a lot of work with engagement. So we use Lean Plum as our customer relationship management. We do things like sending out push notification in a language that is the user's default device and whenever the content is available. We also segment content by region. So in America, gun control is an issue, but in Europe, they don't care that much about gun control, and so we push out content around refugee crisis, and that does better. Another interesting thing to point out in our experiment was we also use publicity, earned media. I don't know how you want to however you want to talk about it. This is an example of when we shared like really, really big launch announcement with organizations like AP or APF and stuff like that. One of the things that we learned is that it's really, really great to do it once and have it propagate throughout the entire news network. The big challenge is that a lot of times they don't actually provide links. So you don't necessarily, you don't have a good insight on the true conversion of that particular activity. So that's one. The second is that because this is an initiative of trying to get to people who don't speak English, it's really hard to see like what are some of the press that are actually covering this piece not in English. And so, so while it is good as an exposure marketing, it's in terms of conversion, we have absolutely no idea if it's successful. One of the things that we're not doing a lot of is paid campaigns, and because I think this might be unique to TED because we're a nonprofit. Obviously for paid campaigns to work, the cost of acquiring the user has to be cheaper than the value that you get, right? So, so I think this is actually mostly driven from our business model. We are actually experimenting with some paid campaigns on iTunes and Facebook and Instagram, just to see what it would be like as a real world data collection. So, moving forward, a couple of things that we're thinking about is with regards to ASO, we're thinking about this idea of halo effect marketing, because TED Conference we're not an app product. We're actually this like a sort of a conference. We're an ideas company. We have, we're going to have a conference happening in Tanzania later on this year and a program, television program coming up in India towards the end of the year. So when we have those marquee events, how can we piggyback app growth on other initiatives from within the organization? That's what we call the halo effect marketing. We're still thinking about what that means and how that affects our ASO strategy throughout the year. The SEO stuff is probably pretty obvious. I don't think we're doing a terrible job at it, but also there's a lot of things that we could potentially be doing better, especially with universal search, especially with lots of multiple languages. The rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward there. I want to talk a little bit about China. China is in red because we have no idea what's going on in China. So especially with regards to Android, what we do know is that we found about 98 cases of fake apps, and we have taken down 40 of them. Basically, the fake apps are apps that uses our brand and our content with our consent. And we also know that Google Play isn't in China, but our Android numbers from China is number 2. So if you guys have experience deploying content and apps in China, I would love to talk to you. All right. So to summarize what I just talked about, we look at international growth as a multi-channel strategy, and not just as marketing, but also from content, from product design, and so on and so forth. What we learned was that translating apps is really hard. But it is worthwhile, especially if you have content that resonates with the global markets. We learned that, comparing app store statistics between multiple channels is actually really, really difficult, and probably is inconsistent. And largely, exposure marketing is somewhat harder to quantify, especially when it comes to multiple languages. What we did well is the A/B testing really, really helped us a lot, and being very, very meticulously detailed and being obsessive compulsive about your app store, how it's presented, makes a huge difference. All right, thank you.